I didn't think a simple family dinner could become the moment I realized I was being quietly erased in front of people who were supposed to care about me. But that's exactly what happened the night everything shifted. I still remember stepping out of my car that evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Chicago, the kind of place where every house looks carefully maintained and every porch light feels like it's watching you arrive. My sister Jessica Miller had insisted I come, saying it would be just a small family dinner. Nothing formal, nothing complicated, and for a moment I actually believed her. I was Emily Carter, and I told myself I could handle whatever version of family I was walking into, even if it always felt like I was arriving slightly out of place. Jessica's house was already warm with light when I walked in, the smell of roasted chicken and baked vegetables filling the air, and her husband Mark Miller greeted me with a polite nod that felt more like obligation than welcome. Olivia Miller, my niece, came running through the hallway in socks that slid across the hardwood floor, laughing loudly in a way that made the whole house feel briefly softer, and I smiled because kids always had a way of resetting the atmosphere, even when adults couldn't. Dinner started the way these things usually do, with polite conversation that slowly revealed old patterns I thought we had outgrown, Jessica steering topics in subtle directions that made it clear she still saw me as the less stable one, the one who didn't quite measure up to her version of success. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the food, the clinking of silverware, the normalcy of it all, but I could feel the familiar tension sitting just beneath the surface like a low hum no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. At some point, Jessica's eyes landed on the necklace I was wearing, a simple but elegant piece of jewelry that had been in my possession for years, something I rarely even thought about until I wore it again that night. It wasn't flashy, but it carried meaning for me, something I kept more for memory than appearance, yet Jessica gave it a quick once-over and smirked, slightly before making a comment about how it looked like something you might pick up at a flea market if you didn't know better. She said it casually, almost jokingly, but it landed in the room with enough weight to change the temperature of the conversation for me, even if everyone else just kept eating like nothing had happened. I laughed it off because that's what I always did in situations like that. But I noticed Olivia staring at the necklace more intently now, her curiosity sharpening in a way that felt innocent at first, the way children fixate on anything that sparkles or moves. She leaned closer across the table, asking if she could touch it, then if she could try it on just for a moment, her voice carrying that mix of excitement and entitlement that kids sometimes develop when adults don't set clear boundaries. I remember Jessica smiling at her daughter's interest, but not saying anything to stop it. And that silence ended up mattering more than anything anyone actually said at the table. The conversation kept flowing around me, but I found myself increasingly aware of Olivia's eyes tracking the necklace every time I moved, as if it had become the most important object in the room without anyone officially deciding it should be. I told myself it was harmless, just a child being a child, and I focused on finishing my meal while the evening slowly continued its quiet drift towards something I couldn't quite name yet. I should have recognized the shift the moment Olivia Miller stopped eating and started watching me like the necklace had become the only thing in the room that mattered. But at the time I told myself it was just a passing phase, something that would fade once dessert arrived, and the conversation moved on like it always did in family gatherings that were more about appearances than connection. The evening continued with the same uneasy rhythm, plates being cleared, polite laughter rising and falling too quickly to feel natural, and Jessica Miller occasionally glancing at me with that familiar expression she used whenever she wanted to remind me that I was, in her eyes, slightly out of place in her carefully controlled world. Mark Miller mostly stayed quiet, offering short comments about work and weather, the kind of safe topics that kept everything from turning too real, while I tried to focus on staying calm and present even as I felt that subtle tightening in my chest that always came before conversations took a turn I would later wish I had left sooner. Olivia, however, was no longer just observing. She was fully fixated, her small hands resting on the edge of the table as she leaned closer each time I moved, her eyes tracking the necklace with a kind of intense curiosity that felt far too focused for a child her age. At one point she asked again if she could see it up close, her voice bright and insistent, and I gently told her it was not something to be handled, trying to keep my tone light so it would not escalate into something awkward in front of everyone. Jessica let out a small laugh at that, the kind of laugh that was not really about humor but about dismissal, and she said something about how children are just naturally curious and that I should not be so protective over something that looked, in her words, inexpensive. That word lingered in the air longer than anything else said that evening, and I noticed Olivia reacting to it immediately, as if it confirmed something she already believed, her attention sharpening even further as she reached across the space between us. I remember the exact moment her hand came too close, not in a sudden dramatic way, but in a slow and confident movement that suggested she believed there would be no resistance, no boundary that would actually hold her back. I instinctively leaned away and placed my hand over the necklace, reminding her gently that it stayed with me and was not something to be taken or worn, but Jessica immediately interjected, telling me not to make a scene over what she called a harmless moment of childhood curiosity. That phrase, harmless moment, felt wrong in my mind even as she said it, because what I was experiencing was a growing sense of unease that no one else at the table seemed willing to acknowledge. Olivia pouted briefly but did not retreat. Instead, she circled the idea in her mind like it was still available for negotiation, and I could see her glancing at her mother for permission that was never clearly denied. The conversation at the table continued around us, forks tapping against plates, someone mentioning a recent school event, another person laughing at a story I barely followed, but I was now fully aware of the small space between me and Olivia, a space that felt thinner with every passing second. Jessica's tone softened as she spoke to her daughter, but not in a way that set limits. Instead, it encouraged the feeling that this was something she could still win if she simply waited or pushed at the right moment. I shifted in my chair, adjusting the necklace slightly so it rested more securely, and that small movement seemed to trigger something in Olivia, a decision forming in her expression that I did not fully understand yet but would remember clearly later. The atmosphere remained outwardly calm, but beneath it I could sense a quiet alignment forming between curiosity, entitlement, and dismissal, all converging toward a point that was about to change the entire tone of the evening in a way none of us at that table were prepared for. I can still recall how quickly the mood shifted from uncomfortable to irreversible, like something in the room had been quietly waiting for the smallest opening to change everything at once. Olivia Miller had stopped pretending she was just curious and instead began circling that necklace with a kind of focused determination that made the rest of the table feel distant, almost irrelevant. I remember adjusting my posture again, trying to stay calm, trying to keep the moment from becoming something larger than it already felt. But Jessica Miller's presence made that impossible because she continued to treat the situation as if I were the one exaggerating it rather than the one experiencing it. Mark Miller reached for his glass of water and said something about how kids go through phases of obsession, his tone casual and dismissive, as if that explanation alone was supposed to resolve everything. But Olivia was no longer in a phase. She was locked in, her attention narrowing to a single point, and I could feel the weight of that attention every time I moved even slightly. She leaned forward again, this time closer than before, her eyes fixed on the necklace with an intensity that made me instinctively place my hand over it once more, a quiet protective gesture that should have ended the conversation but instead seemed to escalate it in a way I did not anticipate. Jessica immediately reacted with frustration, saying I was making things uncomfortable over something that belonged in the category of costume jewelry, her words sharp enough to cut through the polite atmosphere of the table. I remember pausing for a moment, choosing not to respond immediately, because I was trying to decide whether this was simply another one of her dismissive remarks or something that required a firmer boundary. Olivia took that pause as opportunity rather than hesitation, and in a sudden movement driven by excitement rather than malice, she reached out again, her fingers closing around the necklace before I had fully processed what was happening. The motion was not violent, but it was decisive enough that the entire table seemed to freeze for a second afterward, as if everyone realized at the same time that a line had just been crossed. I instinctively reached to stop it and gently guided her hand away, keeping my voice calm as I told her firmly that she needed to let go and that the necklace was not something to take or wear without permission. Olivia's expression shifted immediately, confusion mixing with frustration, and she looked toward her mother as if expecting correction or reassurance. But Jessica instead let out a short laugh, and told me I was reacting far too strongly to what she called a harmless child moment. That word harmless again hung in the air, but now it felt completely disconnected from what I was experiencing, because nothing about the situation felt harmless anymore. I could feel my pulse steady but alert as I carefully secured the necklace back into place, my attention no longer on the conversation around me, but on maintaining control of a moment that was slipping away from shared understanding. Olivia crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair, visibly upset, but Jessica immediately soothed her in a way that did not involve setting limits, instead framing the situation as if I had overreacted to something trivial. The table resumed its noise, forks against plates and scattered comments about unrelated topics, but the atmosphere had changed permanently, like a layer of trust had been quietly removed and no one had acknowledged it out loud. I noticed Mark looking down at his plate, avoiding eye contact with everyone, while Jessica continued speaking as if nothing significant had occurred, her tone returning to normal with practiced ease. But I could not return to normal, because I now understood that the boundaries I assumed existed in this family setting were not shared by everyone in the room, and that realization made every second that followed feel heavier than the last. I could feel the evening beginning to fracture into two completely different versions of reality, one where everything remained politely ordinary, and another where something had already shifted beyond repair, even if no one was willing to acknowledge it out loud. Olivia Miller sat back in her chair with her arms crossed, her expression still clouded with frustration, but the energy that had been directed at curiosity was now replaced with a kind of quiet resistance, as if she believed she had been unfairly denied something she was entitled to. Jessica Miller immediately moved to comfort her daughter, leaning in with a soft voice that contrasted sharply with the dismissive tone she had used toward me only moments earlier, and I remember noticing how quickly she could switch between those two versions of herself depending on who she was addressing. Mark Miller continued to stay out of it, focusing on his plate as if avoiding engagement was the safest possible contribution he could make to the situation, and in that silence I began to understand that no one at this table was going to help clarify what had just happened. The conversation attempted to recover, someone mentioning an upcoming school event and another person talking about work deadlines, but it all felt artificially layered over something unresolved, like a thin sheet placed over a crack that was still spreading underneath. I kept my hand near the necklace without drawing attention to it, not because I believed it was in immediate danger anymore, but because I now understood that the boundaries around it were not universally respected, and that understanding changed the way I perceived every movement around me. Olivia occasionally glanced at it again, no longer with excitement, but with lingering fixation, as if the earlier attempt had not ended her interest, but only interrupted it temporarily. Jessica eventually returned to a more neutral tone and resumed speaking as though the earlier moment was already fading into irrelevance, but I could still feel its presence in the space between sentences, in the way laughter no longer felt natural, and in the way eye contact was avoided just a little more often than before. At one point, Jessica made another remark about how sensitive I had become over the years, framing my reaction as part of a larger pattern rather than a response to what had just occurred, and I remember sitting still for a moment, trying to decide whether to respond or simply let it pass the way I usually did. The instinct to maintain peace in these situations was strong, something I had carried with me for a long time in this family dynamic. But something about the atmosphere now made that instinct feel less like patience and more like surrender. Olivia leaned toward her mother and whispered something I could not fully hear, but Jessica responded with a small smile that did not include me, and that detail stayed with me more than anything else because it reinforced a sense of alignment that I was clearly not part of. The rest of the meal continued in a slow, uneven rhythm, plates gradually emptying, conversations drifting without focus, and I found myself increasingly detached from the idea that this was still a normal dinner. By the time the table began to clear, I realized that what had changed was not just a single moment involving a necklace, but the underlying assumption that we all shared the same understanding of respect, boundaries, and meaning, and that realization made it harder to pretend that anything here was still unchanged. I remember thinking that the hardest part of the evening had already passed, that whatever tension had built up around the necklace had been absorbed and softened by the return to normal conversation, But that assumption quickly proved to be wrong in a way I did not see coming. Olivia Miller had grown quieter, not in the sense of losing interest, but in the way children sometimes do when they are processing a boundary they do not agree with, and I could feel her attention returning in small, measured glances that suggested she was still thinking about the object rather than the moment that had just passed. Jessica Miller seemed satisfied that things had settled, continuing to speak about unrelated topics with a tone that suggested the earlier disruption was already beneath consideration. And Mark Miller finally leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the situation had resolved itself without consequence. I, however, felt something different, a lingering awareness that nothing had actually been resolved, only temporarily contained. As dessert was brought out, the atmosphere shifted again into something resembling forced normalcy, with plates of pie and coffee appearing on the table and conversation restarting in lighter tones. But even then I noticed Olivia occasionally glancing at the necklace whenever she thought no one was watching. At one point she leaned toward Jessica and whispered again, this time longer, her expression serious in a way that felt unusual for her age, and Jessica responded with a soft smile and a quiet reassurance that I could not hear fully, but could easily interpret by her body language as encouragement rather than restriction. That moment stayed with me because it confirmed what I had started to suspect earlier, that the limits I assumed would naturally exist in this environment were not being reinforced in the same way I expected them to be. I shifted slightly in my seat, more aware now of my surroundings than of the food in front of me, and I remember thinking that I was no longer participating in a shared experience, but instead observing a situation that I was somehow still physically inside of. Jessica eventually turned the conversation toward childhood stories, laughing at something Mark said, and for a brief moment the table appeared unified again, as if the earlier tension had been overwritten by familiarity and repetition. But Olivia's silence during that stretch felt different from before, less distracted and more deliberate, and I could sense her attention returning to the necklace whenever the conversation paused even slightly. I tried to tell myself that it was simply curiosity fading in and out, something that would naturally dissipate as the evening ended, yet my awareness of it only grew sharper with each passing minute. When I reached for my glass of water, I noticed Olivia tracking the movement, and that small detail made me realize how closely she was still observing me despite the outward calm. Jessica eventually stood up to begin clearing the table, signaling the natural winding down of the dinner, and everyone else followed her lead in a slow, routine way that suggested the evening was approaching its conclusion. I remember feeling a brief sense of relief at that moment, thinking that once the structure of the meal ended, the tension attached to it would also dissolve. But that feeling lasted only until Olivia stepped closer again, her presence returning to my side of the space with a renewed focus that was no longer hidden behind conversation. It was in that quiet transition between sitting and standing, between ending and departure, that I began to understand that whatever had been building throughout the evening was not something that would simply disappear with dessert or polite goodbyes, but something that was still in motion, waiting for a final moment that had not yet arrived. I had started to believe the evening was finally transitioning into its natural ending, the kind where chairs scrape softly against hardwood floors, coffee cups are half empty, and conversations fade into the routine rhythm of people preparing to leave. But that sense of closure was fragile in a way I did not fully recognize yet. Olivia Miller stayed unusually close to me as Jessica Miller moved between the kitchen and dining room, collecting plates and stacking them with practiced ease, and I noticed that Olivia was no longer simply watching from a distance, but instead positioning herself within reach, as if she was waiting for a moment that had already been decided in her mind. Mark Miller had stepped away briefly to answer a phone call, and in that absence the room felt quieter, less supervised, more open to small decisions that might otherwise have been interrupted. I remember adjusting the necklace slightly again without thinking too much about it, a simple movement meant to make myself more comfortable, but Olivia's eyes immediately followed it with renewed intensity, as if that motion had confirmed something she had been waiting to see. Jessica's voice echoed from the kitchen as she asked Olivia to help bring dishes to the sink, but Olivia hesitated, her attention clearly divided between obeying and remaining focused on what she considered more important in that moment. I could feel a subtle tightening in the atmosphere again, not loud or obvious, but present in the way silence began to linger longer than it should between ordinary household sounds. When Jessica returned, she noticed Olivia still standing near me and gave her a gentle reminder to help clean up, but her tone lacked any real firmness, more like a suggestion than a boundary, and Olivia responded with only partial attention, her eyes still drifting back to the necklace. I began to feel increasingly aware that the evening was not actually winding down in a clean line, but instead circling around a point that had not yet been fully addressed. As I stood to place my own plate in the kitchen, Olivia followed closely behind, not in a way that felt aggressive, but with a persistence that made her presence difficult to ignore. Jessica was speaking to Mark again now that he had returned, their attention divided between conversation and cleanup, and neither of them appeared to notice how closely Olivia was tracking my movements. At one point, Olivia reached the edge of the table before I did, placing herself directly in the path of where I was going, and I paused briefly, unsure whether she was simply trying to help or whether her focus had shifted into something more intentional. Jessica called out again for her to assist with the dishes, but the request lacked urgency, and Olivia responded by stepping closer to me instead of toward the kitchen, her attention narrowing once again to the necklace that had been the center of her interest all evening. I remember feeling a quiet sense of realization forming in that moment, not sudden but steady, that whatever restraint had been present earlier was no longer being reinforced in the same way, and that the structure of the evening was no longer guiding behavior as clearly as it had at the beginning. The house was still full of familiar sounds, water running in the sink, chairs shifting, casual conversation continuing in fragments. But beneath all of it, I could sense that the situation had entered a phase where small actions carried more weight than before. I adjusted my position slightly, not out of fear but out of awareness, understanding that the night had not yet reached its final shape, and that something unresolved was still moving quietly toward its conclusion. I remember the exact moment the evening stopped feeling like it was simply winding down and started feeling like it was being quietly pulled towards something unavoidable, even though no one in the room was openly acknowledging that shift. The kitchen was still active with the sound of running water and the clinking of dishes, and Jessica Miller was moving between the sink and the table with the kind of efficiency that suggested she believed everything was under control. But Olivia Miller remained unusually close to me, no longer pretending to be distracted by anything else in the room. Mark Miller had returned from his phone call and was now helping in small, absent-minded ways, stacking plates and wiping the table without engaging deeply in the situation, and his lack of attention made the space feel even less structured than before. I could feel Olivia's presence as a steady pressure beside me, not overwhelming but persistent, as if she had quietly decided that the earlier interruptions were temporary and that her focus could now resume. Jessica spoke casually about school schedules and upcoming errands, her voice carrying through the kitchen as she continued cleaning, but I noticed she did not once directly address the growing stillness between Olivia and me. At one point, I moved slightly toward the counter, and Olivia moved with me almost immediately, closing the distance in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like alignment with a private intention. I remember pausing for a brief second, unsure whether to acknowledge it or continue acting as though it was simply normal behavior, but something in the air made it difficult to ignore anymore. Jessica called out again for Olivia to help rinse dishes, and this time her tone carried a little more firmness, yet Olivia responded only halfway, her attention divided in a way that clearly showed where her focus truly was. I adjusted the necklace again without realizing I was doing it, a small unconscious gesture, and I saw Olivia's gaze lock onto that movement immediately, as if it confirmed that the object remained central to her thoughts. The conversation in the kitchen continued in fragments, overlapping voices and routine instructions, but I felt increasingly separated from it, as if I was standing slightly outside the normal flow of the evening while still physically present within it. Olivia stepped a little closer once more, not speaking, not asking, simply observing with a quiet intensity that felt more deliberate than earlier in the evening. Jessica finally noticed the proximity and gently reminded her daughter to stay focused on helping, but the reminder lacked any real enforcement, and Olivia responded by shifting her position only slightly before returning her attention to me again. I could sense a pattern forming now, not chaotic but consistent, as if every distraction in the room was temporary and every moment of attention eventually circled back to the same point. Mark placed another plate in the sink and commented lightly about how quickly the evening had gone, but his words felt disconnected from what I was experiencing, as though we were not fully sharing the same version of the moment anymore. I remember feeling a growing awareness that whatever boundaries I assumed were understood were not being actively reinforced by anyone else, and that realization changed how I interpreted even the smallest movement around me. Olivia's stillness beside me felt different now, less like hesitation and more like waiting, and I found myself becoming more conscious of every inch of space between us. The house was still filled with familiar domestic sounds, but beneath them I could sense a quiet concentration building in a way that suggested the evening was no longer simply ending on its own, but instead moving toward a final point that had not yet revealed itself. I remember thinking that the night had finally settled into its final stage, the kind where everything becomes predictable again. Dishes are nearly finished, conversations are winding down, and people begin to prepare for polite goodbyes. But that sense of closure was interrupted by a subtle shift in attention that I could feel before I fully understood it. Olivia Miller was no longer simply standing near me. She was positioned in a way that made her presence unavoidable, as if she had gradually moved into alignment with a decision she had been building toward throughout the entire evening. Jessica Miller continued speaking with Mark Miller about something unrelated, her voice relaxed and confident, as if the night had already been categorized as uneventful. But I noticed that her attention was divided in a way that left gaps where important details were no longer being observed. I adjusted my stance slightly, still near the kitchen counter, and Olivia mirrored the movement almost immediately, closing distance without urgency, but with unmistakable focus. There was a moment when I looked toward Jessica, expecting at least some acknowledgement of the proximity, but she was still occupied with stacking dishes and continuing casual conversation, treating the environment as if it were already fully resolved. Olivia's gaze, however, remained fixed on the necklace, and I could feel that fixation even when I was not looking directly at her. The necklace itself felt heavier in my awareness now, not physically but conceptually, as if it had become a point of tension that shaped how the space around it was being experienced. Mark placed another plate in the sink and commented about how quickly evenings like this pass, and Jessica responded with a light laugh, but neither of them seemed to notice how still Olivia had become beside me. I remember pausing again, unsure whether to move away or simply remain where I was, because any movement now felt like it might trigger a response that the room was not fully prepared to handle. Olivia leaned slightly forward, her attention narrowing further, and I could sense that this was no longer curiosity in the way it had been earlier in the evening, but something more fixed, as if she had mentally committed to a direction and was no longer evaluating alternatives. Jessica finally turned her head briefly, noticing Olivia's proximity, and reminded her again to help finish cleaning, but her tone remained gentle rather than corrective, and Olivia responded with only a slight shift in posture before returning her focus to me. I could feel a quiet tension forming again, not loud or disruptive, but steady and concentrated, as if the entire room was unconsciously organizing itself around a moment that had not yet happened. I adjusted the necklace once more without thinking, a small habitual movement, and Olivia immediately tracked it, her eyes following with renewed intensity that made me fully aware that every action was being observed more closely than before. Jessica resumed conversation with Mark, and their voices blended into the background of clinking dishes and running water, but I felt increasingly separate from that rhythm, as though I was no longer fully part of the same sequence of events. Olivia stepped closer again, reducing the remaining space between us to something minimal, and I remember becoming acutely aware of how little attention was being given to this interaction by anyone else in the room. There was no interruption, no correction, no redirection that held any weight, only a continued flow of domestic activity that seemed to assume everything was still within normal boundaries. In that silence between responsibilities and distractions, I understood that whatever resolution was coming would not be guided by conversation or instruction, but by whatever decision was already forming quietly in front of me. I remember the exact moment everything finally reached its breaking point, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet instant when every unspoken assumption in the room stopped working at the same time. Olivia Miller was standing close enough that I could feel her presence without needing to look directly at her, and I knew with a kind of calm certainty that the entire evening had been building toward whatever was about to happen next. Jessica Miller was still at the sink with Mark Miller beside her, both of them continuing their routine of clearing dishes and talking about ordinary things, completely unaware that the rhythm they were following no longer matched what was unfolding just a few feet away. I remember adjusting my position slightly, not because I was trying to escape anything, but because I was fully aware now that attention had narrowed to a single point, and that point was not going to shift on its own. Olivia's gaze was fixed, steady, and no longer distracted by anything else in the room, and I could see that whatever curiosity had driven her earlier in the evening had transformed into something far more focused and deliberate. The necklace rested against me as it had all night, but in that moment it felt like it had become the center of a space that no one else had fully acknowledged until it was already too late to ignore. Jessica laughed softly at something Mark said, her voice blending into the background of running water and clinking dishes, but her tone carried the same ease it had all evening, as if nothing significant had ever developed at the table. I looked toward her briefly, expecting some awareness of what was happening nearby, but she did not turn, did not pause, and did not interrupt the flow of her own conversation. Olivia shifted closer in a small but decisive movement, closing the remaining space between us to almost nothing, and I could feel that this was no longer about asking or waiting, but about acting on something she had already decided internally. I remember feeling an unusual clarity in that moment, not panic, not confusion, but a simple recognition that the structure of the evening had completely dissolved and no one was actively maintaining it anymore. The house still sounded normal, with dishes, water, and conversation continuing in parallel, but those sounds no longer felt connected to the situation I was standing in. Jessica finally turned her head slightly, as if sensing movement, but her attention moved past us without stopping, and she returned immediately to what she was doing as though nothing required correction. Olivia's hand moved in a single quick motion toward the necklace, not hidden, not sudden in a way that suggested surprise, but direct and fully committed, and I instinctively responded at the same moment, securing it and preventing any separation. There was no struggle, no escalation, only a brief pause where both of us understood exactly what had just been attempted and what had just been prevented, and in that pause the entire room seemed to register something had changed even if no one fully acknowledged it yet. Jessica's voice stopped mid-sentence. Mark turned slightly from the sink, and the background noise of the kitchen felt like it had briefly stepped backward in volume as attention shifted toward us. I remember holding still, maintaining control of the situation without raising my voice, while Olivia looked toward her mother as if expecting validation or explanation, but Jessica's expression remained uncertain in a way that suggested she had only just realized how long she had not been paying attention. The silence that followed was not loud or dramatic, but it was absolute in a way that made the earlier noise feel distant and irrelevant. In that moment, I understood that the evening had not simply ended or escalated, but had reached a point where every assumption about boundaries, attention, and understanding between us had finally collapsed into something that could no longer be ignored or softened by routine.